Today is the 20th of April, 2012. We are at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York. My name is Wayne Clarke. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and date and place of birth, please?
Seth Rosner, January 6, 1931, New York City.
Did you attend school in New York City?
I did not. I grew up in Rochelle, New York, in Westchester County. I went to Henry Barnard Elementary School and New Rochelle High School before I went to college.
What year did you graduate from high school?
1948.
And did you go on to college right after that?
I went directly to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. Graduated from Wesleyan in June of 1952.
And when did you go into the service?
I entered the service on April Fool's Day, 1956.
And you had received a draft notice?
I had received a draft notice the preceding fall, and received my classification 1A, and had applied for possible appointment to Navy OCS.
Now, why did you pick the Navy?
Well, I loved the sea. I had been fortunate enough to have my mom and dad take me on a transatlantic crossing on the New Amsterdam in 1950 when I was a teenager. And I loved the sea. Came back by ship as well. The French line flagship Liberté on her maiden voyage, in fact. And I loved the sea. Curious aspect of that, I did very well at OCS. I was a lawyer already when I went into the service. And lawyers were verbal. We're not particularly skilled as a group in all of the stuff that goes into officer training, navigation and celestial navigation and gunnery and vectors and engineering and damage control and all of the things that went into the classes we had. But for some unaccountable reason, I graduated 5th in a class of over 500, and as a result, basically got my choice of duty station because one was more likely to get one's choice the higher one ranked in the graduating class. So actually, when we got out, all of the mates in my section, Lima 5, class 27 at Navy OCS, said, "Oh man, Seth, this is really going to be great. You'll have your choice of cushy shore duty in San Francisco or New Orleans or New York." And I said to them all, I don't want shore duty. I joined the Navy because I really love the sea and I want a large combatant ship. And fortunately, I got just what I wanted, an attack aircraft carrier, USS Intrepid.
And when did you actually set foot on the Intrepid?
It was October of 1956. I got my commission, I think, on August 3rd. At least that's the certificate of appointment as an ensign was effective August 3rd, 1956. But I was directed then to a Naval Communications School in Newport. I was going to be a communications watch officer on board Intrepid. I already knew that I had an assignment to Intrepid. And then 4 weeks of Naval Justice School because I was designated to succeed the legal officer of Intrepid when I reported on board.
And what was the Intrepid like back then?
Well, the Intrepid was a mess when I reported on board because she had come back from a med cruise in September of 1956 and went directly into the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And when I reported on board in October 56, she was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard in dry dock. She was there for a major overhaul. They put on the Angler flight deck. You recall the World War II carriers were all axial flight decks, and the Angler deck permitted a much safer recovery of returning aircraft. Hurricane bow, which enclosed the bow, which on the World War II, in the World War II format of the ship was open to the sea, and a whole bunch of other significant work. They had to upgrade the catapults forward on the flight deck. So we were there until, my recollection, April of 1957. We had a skeleton crew at the time, excuse me, and probably normal complement of Intrepid with the air group embarked was, I recollect, around 3,600 officers and men. I don't think we had 500 on board the ship when I reported on board in October of '56.
Mhm. And once you left dry dock, where did you go for your first cruise?
Ship went from dry dock in Brooklyn to Bayonne, New Jersey for final outfitting, and we were in the Navy Yard in Bayonne for some period of time, not very long, a few weeks I think, and then steamed down to Newport, NOB, not Newport, Norfolk, which was our home port for as long as I was on board the ship.
Did you go on any sort of a shakedown cruise after the overhaul?
Yes, when we got to Norfolk, we took on board an air group, several squadrons of aircraft. My recollection is it was Air Group 6 out of Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is where they were based, the Naval Air Station at Virginia Beach, for carrier qualifications. The pilots who had not qualified for carrier operations, launching and recovering aircraft, had to do their qualifications, and we were probably 3 or 4 weeks doing what they call CAQUALs, carrier qualifications, off the Virginia Capes. Then came back into Norfolk for a brief time, refueling, arming, and so on, and then we went down to Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for our Shakedown Cruise.
Mm-hmm. And what type of aircraft were aboard?
I probably can give those to you squadron by squadron. We had a squadron of propeller-driven ADs, the attack bomber that figured so heavily in the Vietnam War some years later. Big, thumping aircraft with tremendous load capacity. Not very quick, but extraordinarily strongly built, and took a lot of damaging fire and survived during the Vietnam War years later. We had a squadron of F-2H Banshees. We refer to them as the Airedales. The pilots refer to them as banjos. That's a fighter squadron. We had a squadron of FJ-3 Mike Furies, which was the Navy equivalent of the Sabrejet, F-86 Sabrejet. A squadron of AD Skyraider bombers, a squadron of Cougars, Grumman F-9, F-8 Bravo fighters. Some of those, if I recall correctly, were outfitted for reconnaissance work as well, but I'm not certain about that. And we had the rescue helicopters. We had maybe 3 or 4 rescue helicopters.
Mm-hmm. So you headed down to Guantanamo.
Well, Guantanamo was interesting. Some of the experiences a young guy first in the service had on liberty in Guantanamo are not fit for the camera, I think, and for recording. But we were in Cuba for I believe almost 2 months. Again, qualifying, doing air operations, operating with plane guard destroyers. We had a squadron of destroyers sent down with us. And in fact, I was very glad for that one experience. One of the destroyer captains was taking his ship over to Big Island, Jamaica, and he asked my skipper, Captain Massey, if he had any junior officers, because he had space to take 3 or 4 junior officers, and Captain Massey asked me if I wanted to go, and I said, sure, I'd love to. So I went one weekend on this destroyer, my only sea experience in anything other than an aircraft carrier. And we ran into some rough weather, steaming between Guantanamo and Jamaica, and I found myself tossing around in a berth in a way that I've never experienced in Intrepid, even in very heavy weather.
And did you spend much time ashore in Cuba?
Not a great deal of time. Essentially, we would have liberty when we came in from our operations for a weekend. We wouldn't have the whole weekend. We'd have the day off. In port, we were on port and starboard watches, so half the ship would remain aboard and half would be on liberty. So essentially, when we had liberty, it would be from 0800 until 2100 in the evening, and then we had to be back aboard. One of the things I recall about my first visit to the Officers Club was stunning and happy. That first night, the first afternoon there, we all went ashore. And remember, this is 1957. Try to recall what prices were like in 1957. But a drink at the bar in the Officers Club was 20 cents. A beer was a dime. Except during happy hour. During happy hour, everything was half price. So a martini was a dime. A double martini was 20 cents. And if you can imagine a bunch of young ensigns and lieutenants, junior grade, being ashore for the first time as officers, fancy big men with big britches, being able to get drunk on 40 or 50 cents, it was pretty stunning. And I mean, really wiped out so much that we sometimes needed assistance getting back up the accommodation ladder to the Intrepid because we were anchored out at Guantanamo. We were not tied up at a pier. It was too large a ship then.
What was your, if I can use the term, typical workday like?
Well, before, let's put aside for the moment when we were in the Navy Yard, because we had a skeleton crew. Actually, I was not the legal officer of Intrepid until January or February of 1957, because Stan Mann, the legal officer whom I was succeeding, didn't leave the ship until sometime in late January or early February 57. Therefore, I was doing duty as a communications watch officer. I was standing OOD, officer of the deck watches, not on the bridge because we weren't underway, but at the quarterdeck, and learning about the ship and the Navy. And on board, then essentially my duties as legal officer or assistant legal officer, about to succeed the legal officer, were in the discipline area. When there were discipline problems, the legal officer, of course, goes through the vetting process, finds out what happened, reports to the executive officer or the CO, and recommends whatever punishment or no punishment, depending on what the outcome of the investigation.
Did that keep you busy?
That kept, well, in Brooklyn, really not, because we had a skeleton crew. And there were not very many problems. The crew was dealing with all of the Navy Yard workers who were engaged in refurbishing the ship and doing all of this major reconstruction work. So there really wasn't that much happening to create any kind of trouble. Being in a skeleton crew, there wasn't the crew friction that you have when you're underway with a full complement on board, and any little dispute can escalate into into a fist fight or something like that. So there was not a great deal of legal officer work on board. One of the other duties that I had, both before and after I became the full-fledged, if you will, legal officer, was legal assistance officer, helping crew members who had legal problems, not on the ship but ashore. And among the most frequent of these was a sailor would come and say, "Mr. Rosner, I didn't really know what I was doing. This Encyclopedia Britannica salesman," I shouldn't say Britannica because Britannica is a very good company, but an encyclopedia salesman got me to sign an agreement to buy his set of encyclopedias, and I didn't realize. He said, it's no money down and you only have to pay a little bit, and I signed this agreement, and now they're coming after me. I really don't want the encyclopedia, and I have to pay $5 a month for the next 240 years. I'm exaggerating for effect, but trying to get these youngsters out of that kind of trouble. Not major trouble for probably our viewers, nor would I have considered it major trouble. I was already a young lawyer. But to these kids, looking at a $900 obligation on a contract over many, many years, and they say, how did I sign that? Well, you signed it, but we'll see if we can get out of it. And I was successful in persuading the encyclopedia company to simply go away. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing that I was involved in, apart from the discipline issues.
Mm-hmm. And what other duties were you assigned besides head of the legal office?
Well, a communications watch officer, all radio communications that came to the ship came to the radio operation room, and the CWO, communications watch officer's responsibility was vetting that and taking it to the exec or the captain, mm-hmm. Or both, depending, and then responding, essentially being the go-between, the connection between command and the communications function. Mm-hmm. My recollection at the time is that I didn't have a top secret, I had a secret clearance, and I had crypto clearance, because I had CWOs needed to have crypto.
Now, was your time split evenly between the two positions? Or?
No, not, well, it depends. In the Navy Yard, I couldn't quantify it because you did what you needed to do at the particular time. Mm-hmm. When we got underway, when we left the Navy Yard and got down to Norfolk and then out of Norfolk into operations, I was no longer a communication watch officer because when I became legal officer, my skipper relieved me of all duties as a CWO. I had more than enough to do as a legal officer.
Now, did you have a staff working for you?
Yeah, I had, in the legal office, I had, at our fullest, 3 yeomen working for me on discipline matters, legal matters, assignments that my captain, my commanding officer gave me. There were times, for example, when one of our crew got in trouble ashore and had to go to court, and this is when we were in port, of course, and Captain Massey, my skipper, ordered me to accompany the crew member to court, make sure we could do whatever we could for him. We had one situation where an officer actually had a misdemeanor criminal charge against him in Norfolk, and I had to go down, sort of negotiate with the district attorney's office, and was able to get that resolved. But that's the kind of thing we did in court. Actually, one of the kind of interesting things, interesting to me at the time, and I think perhaps interesting to viewers, I was a lawyer when I went to the Navy. I was legal officer of the ship. And when I reported on board in October of 1956, as is routine, officers reporting to a command have a coming aboard meeting, interview, if you will, with the commanding officer. And I had a very pleasant 30 minutes with Captain Massey, one of the great officers that I ever met, let alone worked for. And he told me about the history of the ship and the traditions of the Navy and all of the things that one would expect to hear from a CO welcoming a new junior officer on board. And he gets finished with this maybe 15 or 20 minute remarks. He said, have you got any questions, Seth? And he had been first naming me because, again, legal works very closely with the commanding officer. Mm-hmm. Normally, the CO will address the junior officer as Mr. Smith or Mr. Rosner or Mr. whatever. But he had been calling me Seth. And he said, have you got any questions? And I said, yes, Captain, I'd like to know if I'll have a chance to qualify as an officer of the deck underway. The whole demeanor and tone changed. Mr. Rosner, he says, what is it with you? He said, you're going to be my legal officer. You're going to have plenty of work to do, as legal officer and discipline officer on this ship. I said, well, Captain, I don't mean to be a wise guy or impertinent or anything like that, but I've got a gold star on my sleeve. That means I'm a general line officer. That means I'm eligible for command at sea. But that doesn't mean anything if I can't qualify as an OD underway and get a letter in my jacket. I said I joined the Navy because I love the sea. I graduated very high in my class at OCS, and I could have had, without any question, a short job at some very attractive location. But I chose to have a large combatant duty station. And when I got Intrepid, I was just out of my mind happy with the circumstance. But I'd really like to have a chance to qualify as an OD underway. As he says to me, young man, he says, we are in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We have a skeleton crew. Right now, there are only 5 qualified underway watch officers on this ship. Myself, the executive officer, the gunnery officer, the navigator, and the first lieutenant. That's it. He said, young man, if you want to qualify underway, and if you can qualify underway, let me tell you, you will qualify as an officer of the deck underway on this ship. And when we got underway, out of the Navy Yard and down to Norfolk and down to Guantanamo, he talked to the navigator, Commander Rieger, and I got regular assignments on the bridge as a junior officer of the deck, learning that craft, and there's an awful lot to learn. And within about 3 or 4 months of our being underway, operating at sea, I had a letter in my jacket qualifying me as an OD underway, and about 3 months after that, the navigator, Commander Rieger, who by designation is the officer of the deck on the bridge at general quarters. When the ship is at battle stations, the captain is on the bridge, the commanding officer, that is, and captain is on the bridge. The navigator is the OD. The executive officer is in the eyes of the ship forward with a second control station where they have a second engine order telegraph for the speed of the ship and a second helmsman. But there's also a junior officer of the deck on the bridge serving under the commander, who is the navigator, and I was that was my general quarter station, junior officer of the deck on the bridge. My captain said, Captain Massey said, he was not aware that any lawyer, legal officer in the history of the Navy had ever stood an underway watch as officer of the deck, let alone qualifying. So I really felt pretty proud of myself at the time. Which is really why I think I mentioned to you when we were preparing for this interview, this certificate of my appointment as an ensign in the Navy is a certificate that is on my wall right next to my certificate of admission to the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. And for some odd reason, I have always treasured this certificate more highly than my admission to the Supreme Court of the United States bar. A little bit crazy, but I love my Navy service.
You want to hold up that photo of the Intrepid?
Sure.
Do you know approximately when that was taken?
Let me take a look at it and make a guess. The likelihood is, and in fact I shouldn't say likelihood, my guess is that, and this was taken when I was aboard, and if I had to make a guess, this probably was taken during our Guantanamo Bay Shakedown Cruise.
Okay.
Which would have been sometime between May and June or July of 1957.
All right. And do you want to hold up that patch?
Oh, this thing. This is the logo of Intrepid when I was aboard. And I bought this intending to have it sewn on the back of the jacket. And I guess in a way, I'm glad I didn't, because the jacket is long, long gone. But I still have this. Interestingly, this is the Intrepid, when I was aboard, was an attack carrier, which is why the hull designation is CVA-11. In World War II, when she served, she was commissioned in 1943 and served in the Pacific in all of the major battles of the Western Pacific. She was CV-11. And in fact, this little baseball cap, former crew member cap, you will see two silhouettes of the Intrepid here. The one in black, the smaller one in black, I'm not sure you can focus in on it, is the format of the Intrepid.
If you just tilt it down just a little bit, I can okay, that's perfect. Okay.
Is the format of Intrepid during World War II. The bow wasn't enclosed. You can probably see, no, I'm not sure you can see, she had two gun, 5-inch cannon turrets just forward of the island and two more just abaft the island. The gray is not a silhouette. The gray Intrepid, that's a plan view from above, and you can see, I think you can see the angled flight deck here.
Okay.
So that's both Intrepids, World War II Intrepid, and then the ship as she was when she came out of the Navy Yard. Actually, she came in the Navy Yard in the black form and came out in the gray form with the angled flight deck.
Okay. What type of quarters did you have aboard?
Well, when I reported on board in October of 1956, because we had a skeleton crew, I had a very not luxurious, I had a cabin that I shared with a lieutenant who was an administrative officer, the admin officer. I had the upper berth because I was an ensign, he was Lieutenant JG, so he had the lower berth. And it was on the one deck just below the flight deck, which is the main deck, and just one or two cabins forward of the executive officer's quarters. So I felt, wow, this is really pretty good. But actually thinking about that reminds me of another facet of my, at that time, impending unhappiness with the choice I had made about going into the Navy. Because when I first reported on board, and the first night that I climbed up in my upper berth in my little cabin, trying to go to sleep, I was surrounded by the most horrendous noise you can imagine. The cabin and the passageway outside the cabin was tiered, filled with lines that had fluids going through them and air going through them, and pumps were going, and I said to myself, I'm going to spend the next 3 years not sleeping. I don't know how I can take this, because the noise seemed to me overpowering in what otherwise was a very quiet ship after taps. The second night I slept better. The first night I didn't sleep at all. Second night I slept better. Third night I didn't hear it at all. Your mind just phases it out, and this what seemed to me the first night to be overpowering noise just went away. In fact, so much did it go away that I could hear the footsteps of my cabin mate coming back to the cabin over this machinery noise, which if I were awake, I probably would not have been able to hear. It was really quite an incredible experience to go through.
Now, your legal office, how big was that?
The legal office itself was not that big. I had the largest desk, and as I say, I had at our maximum, I had 3 yeomen working in the legal office. Each of them had a small desk, typewriter. We didn't have computers or any electronic equipment of any kind, whatever. I think the closest thing we had to an electronic machine was a copying machine. And my recollection, you may be old enough to remember something called a thermofax. But it was not a large office. None of the spaces on the ship are large because you've got so much going on a ship at sea, and especially a carrier with 35 or 3,600 in officers and crew. One of the things that's really quite incredible to people who haven't served at sea on a ship like Intrepid, think about what kind of machinery and personnel you need and what kind of storage you need to serve 12 to 14,000 meals a day, every day. The steam catapults on the ship used up 60 gallons of triple distilled water every time those steam catapults fired, launched an aircraft. Think of what it takes, the machinery it takes, to distill 120,000 gallons of distilled water from seawater every day. And that machinery has to operate all the time. So it's really quite a remarkable city. I had my first wisdom tooth, impacted wisdom tooth, extracted on board Intrepid. There were 3 dentists on board. There were 5 medical officers, not just 1 sick bay, but 2 sick bays and 2 fully equipped operating theaters, surgical operating theaters. So it's really quite a remarkable city, in fact.
Any of your cases really stand out in your mind that?
Cases on board Intrepid?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. I'm not
Funny
sure.
ones or
Well,
serious?
the first thing that comes to my mind, actually, and it is amusing. As legal officer, I worked closely with the sergeant at arms, and we had several sergeants at arms. They typically were gunner's mates, occasionally bosun's mates. But when we were in Guantanamo, one of the sergeant at arms who was at the after bow, where enlisted men came back on return to the ship from Liberty, and they had, of course, a sidearm 45 automatic pistol and a nightstick. And one of the reports that I got one morning after this event happened, a bunch of men came back to the ship from the naval station, Guantanamo. One of them, with a shoestring, had tied a bottle of liquor under his bell-bottom trousers. He had the shoestring tied around just above his knee, and the bottle fit underneath his bell-bottoms. How the Master at Arms, who was a wonderful first-class petty officer, first-class gunner's mate, knew, but he would not tap everybody with his billy stick. But he apparently spied this kid, and he takes his billy stick and whacks him on the leg just below the knee and smashes the bottle. And this young man is standing there with broken glass and a quart of I guess it was Cuban rum, down around his feet. And of course the sergeant at arms writes him up, reports him for illegally trying to bring liquor aboard. And I had that case on my desk the next morning. But my recollection is that captain's mast, which is the Article 15 punishment?
Heard it, probably Article 15.
15. I recommended restriction to the ship, and that's what the captain gave him at the captain's mast 3 or 4 days later.
Anything really serious?
In terms of discipline, not really. One anecdote does come back to mind. The air group, both officers, that is to say the flyers, the aviators, and the support officers in the squadrons, spent most of their time ashore, and were clearly they're sailors. They're at sea, expected to observe the customs of seagoers. But we had I had one case involving a really serious fight. Could have been much more serious, but one of the enlisted men in one of the squadrons was at a scuttlebutt, a little water fountain, and he was cleaning a pocket knife, a little folding pocket knife at the scuttlebutt, fresh water. And one of the ship's company sailors came by and said, "Turn that water off. You can't clean it. Not waste that water that way." And the Airedale, the guy from one of the squadrons, said, "Go swimming yourself." And that escalated into a couple of punches were thrown because the folks in the squadrons really were not aware and conscious of just how much work goes into producing that fresh water.
Mm-hmm.
But that was an example of the kind of tension that could
Mm-hmm.
grow between ship's company and the squadron people.
Okay. You want to tell us about some of your other cruises? You have that card for.
Oh well, actually, yeah. When we came back to Norfolk in the fall of or late summer of 1957, again we did carrier qualifications. Squadrons. The squadrons flew off the ship as we were returning from Guantanamo. Went back to the air station at Virginia Beach and did whatever they do when they're ashore. And after some more provisioning and additional carrier qualifications, Intrepid joined a quite massive NATO combined fleets war games exercise in the North Sea, just off the Norwegian coast. We operated during, it was called Operation Strike Back, and somewhere I have a clipping from the New York Times written by the then Times military journalist expert Harrison Baldwin describing Operation Strike Back, and from a viewpoint much higher up than mine. Mine was simply what we were doing on Intrepid. We operated with two other American carriers, the Saratoga, and here we are in Saratoga Springs, the Forrestal, and Intrepid were the three American carriers. My recollection is that HMS Ark Royal, a Royal Navy aircraft carrier, was with us, and a French carrier whose name I don't recall. We also operated with the Iowa and the Wisconsin, two of the Iowa-class battleships from World War II, a bunch of heavy cruisers and light cruisers. My recollection is that the officer in tactical command, golly, I can't imagine how I can still remember, it was Admiral Robert Peary. His flag was on board Newport News, which was a heavy cruiser, and that was the flagship of that entire operation. Each of the carriers was operating with 3 Plain Guard destroyers. I don't know whether your viewers would be aware, but when a carrier is engaged in flight operations, there are 3 Plain Guards stationed. One is off the port bow, that is to say, forward of the carrier to port. A second is a beam to port, and a third is off the starboard quarter, that is to say, to the right of the ship and astern. Out there is safety to pick up a pilot if a plane goes in the water on launch or recovery into the ship. So each of those carriers had 3 Plain Guard destroyers. In addition to that, there was a 40 destroyer screen, probably, I don't remember what the diameter of that circle would have been, but I'm guessing it would have been at least 20 or 30 miles in diameter, screening the rest of the task force from enemy action. On the other side was a so-called Soviet-based threatening navy. Most of them were submarines. They had some surface ships, but it was a very, very interesting experience. Although my experience really was limited to operating the Intrepid, being where we needed to be. I had one very frightening experience when I actually was on watch on the bridge as OD. Intrepid it was a 12 2024 watch, that is from 8 until midnight, 8 in the evening until midnight. So we were operating our aircraft at darkened ship. All the lights were extinguished, except the red perimeter lights outlining the flight deck, so that when we were recovering aircraft, at least the pilots could find the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And we were operating very closely with Saratoga, one of the other carriers. We had just completed launching our aircraft, and we were steaming at probably 25 knots. The carrier, I shouldn't say the carrier doesn't need, the carrier needs to be in a position to be having 30 knots of wind across the flight deck in order to launch and recover aircraft. In other words, for the aircraft to have sufficient airspeed, 30 knots of wind has to be provided by the ship. So we had been steaming into the wind, steaming faster than the course and direction of the entire task force, because they were steaming at a slower speed. And we were just turning to run downwind to get back into position, so that when we increased speed, we could again have 30 knots of wind across the flight deck. So I had just given the order to turn, instructed my junior officer of the deck to relieve, to advise our plane guard destroyers that we were turning. And the Saratoga, who had been steaming downwind, was just turning into the wind ahead of us. She was steaming on our port bow, turned across in front, and turned into the wind. Her number 3 plane guard was not in the right position, and I recall thinking to myself at the time, I hope that young ensign or JG or whoever has the con on that ship, whoever is the OD, doesn't make a mistake and turn in front of me and runs down, instead runs down our port side, then turns up and catches up with Saratoga. He didn't. He made the wrong decision. He turned right in front of Intrepid. And when I saw that, fortunately, Captain Massey, my commanding officer, was on the bridge because we were just engaged in flight operations, but I had the con. And I said immediately, almost, I don't want to say in panic, but in desperation, I said, right hard rudder. The rudder's going all the way right. We're doing 20, as I said, 25, 26, 27 knots. All engines full astern. And the ship heeled over and started to shake. Some of the men who were below in their berths were tossed out of their berths. And I told my junior officer of the deck to release the plane, our plane guard destroyers, let them scatter and just stay out of the way, and we'll catch up and get in proper formation later. The destroyer that had turned in front of me literally was within yards of being cut in half.
Mm.
I didn't see the superstructure under the overhang of our flight deck bow. All I saw was the mast and that TACAM, electronic TACAM, at the top of the mast. And in fact, maybe a week or 10 days later, when we were on Liberty, after the operation had concluded, when we were in Belfast, Ireland, Northern Ireland, for Liberty, in a little pub, I met a chief petty officer. We were chatting, and he said, "What's your ship?" I said, "Intrepid." He said, "Oh my God, you almost cut us in two." I said, "Yeah, it wasn't my fault, it was your own geese fault." He said, "I know. I was on the fantail, that is to say the extreme stern of that destroyer, and I looked directly overhead as we passed in front of you, and I saw the overhang of Intrepid's flight deck over my head. We were cleared by not more than 15, 20, 30 feet. So it was a really pretty scary experience."
Wow.
As a matter of fact, immediately, Admiral Peary, as I mentioned, the Admiral Officer of Tactical Command of the entire operation, was on the primary tactical circuit, the TAC circuit they call, calling to my commanding officer, because obviously they had seeing what happened on the radar. And he is shouting directly himself into his microphone. Forsyth, that's my captain, Forsyth Massey. Forsyth, what the F are you guys doing over there? So it was a really the scariest single experience of my entire service.
Any Cold War incidents with the Russians?
No, none. No, we really had, other than the only Russians we had any contact with were other Allied submarines and other fleets who were on the other side of this Operation Strike Back war games exercise.
And when did you leave the Intrepid?
Left the Intrepid in the spring of 1958 and was assigned to Naval Air Station Alameda as discipline officer and assistant lead officer. And this was just a wonderful, it made my whole tour just brilliantly happy because I love San Francisco. I had been there before, but to be ashore and to live a 20-minute ride over the Oakland Bay Bridge from San Francisco was just wonderful. I also had bought a little Triumph TR3 sports car, and I got involved in racing in this SCCA Sports Car Club of America racing series in the Bay Area. So it was just a wonderful, wonderful last 15 or 17 months of active duty service.
And then you were discharged from the Navy? Or?
I got my release from active duty in late July of 1959. Sold my Triumph. Took the California Zephyr train from Emeryville in the East Bay back to New York and resumed my career. Well, actually, I didn't resume my career as a lawyer. Again, I lucked out. About 2 months before my release from active duty, I was already a lawyer, as they say. I was offered a 2-year Ford Foundation fellowship in comparative law and civil law, a year getting a master's of law at New York University School of Law, and a year in Paris at the University of Paris, France, the University of Paris law faculty, which I accepted, and I had 2 wonderfully stimulating years, exhilarating years, both from an intellectual viewpoint as a lawyer, and of course the year in Paris was just wonderful.
Now, did you maintain contact with anyone you were in the service with?
Very, very few. In fact, I lost contact with my section mates at OCS, with one exception, and we would telephone or write letters occasionally. But the Navy has a website where each ship has a page where former crew members, if they log on, can put their names and contact other crew members. And I came upon this maybe a year and a half ago, put my name in, and a short time after that, I got an email that so-and-so had just put his name in, and it turned out to be Frank Stratton, who was one of my yeomen in the legal office at Intrepid, which is really quite remarkable because Intrepid went into service in 1943, I think was decommissioned. She served through World War II, through Korea, through Vietnam. She was in the Westpac, I think, during the Vietnam conflict. Was also the retrieval vehicle for picking up some of our space capsules when they returned to ocean. And I think she went out of sight. I think she was decommissioned, although I'm not sure of the date, sometime in the early 1970s. And then actually not a good friend of mine, but an acquaintance of mine from the City Athletic Club where I belong in New York City, went to John Lehman, then Secretary of the Navy, and put on the table the idea he had of making a museum of the Intrepid and bringing her to New York. His name was Zachary Fisher. And he got the Secretary to assign title to Intrepid, to this foundation that he formed, put, I think, over $1 million of his own money into bringing the ship up to New York. And I was there the day the museum opened, actually, and became a life member of the museum. They went through some serious financial problems because they were underfunded in the early times, early days of the museum. Not that many people came, and of course the museum depends very largely on attendance, membership fees, and admission fees. And so I believe the Museum Foundation went into Chapter 11, came out of it, and now is a remarkably successful attraction in New York City. And I've been, in fact, I took my 11-year-old granddaughter there a year and a half ago, and she, as we walked on the pier before we went aboard the ship, she was not unhappy to be there, but she did not seem elated in any way. But I had called the director in advance, and she had been nice enough, Susan Marinhouse, nice enough to assign a staff person, a senior staff person, to give us kind of a VIP tour. And we were there for, I think, 4.5 hours. And Emma Catherine, my little granddaughter, when we walked off the pier, she had this huge smile on her face and said, "Poppy, Poppy, when can we come back?" So she really had a great time, and so did I.
And I'm sure that brought back a lot of memories.
In fact, not only did it bring back a lot of memories, I showed the staff, the two staff guys who were at different times with us, spaces on the ship where they'd never been and they didn't know what the function was. The wardroom, the officers' wardroom, where the officers had meals, had been turned into something completely different. I was able to find two of my former cabins that I'd been in, the one that I described earlier, and the second one that I was assigned when we were down in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay, which was way forward in the what they call the 01 level, right below the flight deck. And it was not a very happy cabin to be in because it was immediately under the catapults. And if you try to sleep when catapults are going literally 8 feet above your head, firing off 8-ton aircraft, sleep is not an option.
How do you think your time in the service changed or affected your life?
Probably the greatest impact of any single series of experiences of my whole life. If one thinks about it, here I was a lawyer, so I was not just out of college, I was 24 years old, 25 years old. But if you think about the responsibility that a young officer has on an Intrepid, it's 2:30 in the morning, you're standing on mid-watch, you're steaming, you're at sea, you've got your plane guards, whether you're in a big operation like Strike Back, or simply on carrier qualifications. You're steaming at 2:30 in the morning, the captain is in his sea cabin, he's not on the bridge. Something happens, some emergency occurs. You've got to decide right now what to do. And you're 24 years old, and you suddenly realize that all of that terribly boring, repetitive exercise and practice and training that you go through day after day after day has become second nature. So you know what to do. And there are not very many places, not very many areas of work where a 22 or 23-year-old kid really has that kind of responsibility. And so coming out of the Navy with that background, I just had a feeling that there was nothing that I couldn't learn to do. If I had to make sacrifices, I could make sacrifices. If I needed to accomplish something, even though it might be beyond what I could imagine in advance, I felt I could do it. And I just don't know of any other equivalent experience that a young man or woman could have than being on a Navy ship as an OD, learning that kind of having that kind of training and learning those skills.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your interview.
Thank you, it's been a lot of fun.